Today, on our timeline here, as we've been moving across, we are in the period of the Kings. So we're kind of right in the middle of our journey through the Old Testament. And I love to read in my spare time. And so I recently started the Game of Thrones series, and I've been reading the first book in Game of Thrones. And as I opened my Bible and found the lesson for today, I had to double check to make sure I wasn't in the wrong book. Sounds like a page right out of Game of Thrones. So we start out with chapter 11, and it says, "In the spring, the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab along with his servants and all the Israelites, and they destroyed the Ammonites, attacking the city of Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem." Now, this was not the way things were done. Kings led their armies into battle. David sent his troops off to war, but for some reason, he himself stays at home. He's not where he's supposed to be. That's problem number one. One evening, David got up from his couch and was pacing back and forth on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. What should David have done next? He probably should have looked away. Nothing good could come of this. Remember how Jesus tells us in Matthew's gospel that anyone who looks at another person lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart? Instead, though, of averting his eyes, David sent someone and inquired about the woman. And the report came back, "Isn't this Eliam's daughter, Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David knows Uriah. Uriah is a general in David's army. This woman is married. David clearly understands that this is adultery. Nevertheless, David sends messengers to get her. And when she came to him, he had sex with her, and she had been purifying herself after her monthly period. So we need to know that despite the images we've seen in movies, Bathsheba was not just taking a bath, and this was not a luxurious moment, nor was it a seductive one. What Bathsheba was doing was fulfilling the law. She was obeying God's command. But David sent for her. And then afterwards, she returned home, and the woman conceived, and she sent word to David and said, "I'm pregnant." Apparently, David hadn't thought about that. Now what? Well, that's where we stop this morning. We read chapter 11, and we read only verses 1 through 5, and then we skip ahead to chapter 12. But the next part is pretty important. What happens next is that David sends for Uriah, and he tries every trick he can think of to get Uriah to come home from the war and visit his wife. So Uriah will think that this child is his. But Uriah is faithful to his troops, and he will not leave his post. 3 times, David tries to convince Uriah to just take a short break, go home, and visit his wife. But Uriah doesn't think it's right to go off and enjoy the comforts of home when his soldiers are still out there. So now David is getting desperate. The next morning, he writes a letter to his servant Joab and sends it with Uriah. The letter tells Joab that he should send Uriah to the front lines so that he'll be killed in battle. So if you didn't catch that, Uriah has to deliver his own death warrant to Joab. As expected, Uriah is killed, along with some other members of David's army. And Joab seems to sense that David hasn't really thought through all the consequences of this, and he's afraid that the king will be angry when he learns how many have died. But whether it's just because he's that callous or because he's so relieved that Uriah is out of the picture that he doesn't care about the cost, David says to the messenger, "Don't be upset about this. Tell Joab The sword, it's that way, taking the life of this person or that person. Continue attacking the city and destroy it. Carry on with the war. Encourage Joab. People die. That's the way it is. Meanwhile, Bathsheba receives the news of her husband's death. Now, David has wronged her twice. First, he violated her, and now he has taken away her husband. In an effort to cover his tracks, or maybe do some damage control, or perhaps even because on some level he actually cared for her, David marries her. But chapter 11 ends with these ominous words. But what David had done was evil in the Lord's eyes. God knew what he had done. David, this is the golden boy. This is the one who defeated Goliath. He's the one who's been called the man after God's own heart. It seems that Bathsheba was a victim many times over and that she was powerless to change it. But God saw what was happening. God saw her, and he knew the truth of her heart and of David's. And God did something. God sent Nathan to remove the blinders from David's eyes. And then Nathan tells David this parable. And this is where we come in with chapter 12. There's a rich man and a poor man, and the rich man has everything he could need or want. Many flocks, all kinds of property. And then there's this poor man, and he has almost nothing except this one little ewe lamb that he bought and raised and fed by his hand and cared for as if it were one of his children. And the time comes for the rich man to provide a feast. And instead of taking from his own flocks, he takes this little lamb from the poor man and prepares that for the feast instead. Nathan tells David this story, and he says, "Now, David, what do you think about that?" And David said, "The person who would do this is demonic. Where is the man's compassion?" And Nathan says, "David, you are the man." And David's eyes are opened. He gets it. He sees what he has done. After everything God did for David, David had become drunk on power to the point where he directly violated God's commandments. He sinned against Bathsheba, against Uriah, and against God himself. David is filled with remorse. And it's at this point that he writes the words that are preserved in Psalm 51. "Have mercy on me, God, according to your faithful love. Wipe away my wrongdoings according to your great compassion. Wash me completely clean of my guilt. Purify me from my sin, because I know my wrongdoings. My sin is always right in front of me. I've sinned against you and you alone. I've committed evil in your sight. Purify me, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and celebration again. Let these bones you crushed rejoice once more." David's repentance is real. His faith is renewed, and his trust in God's grace is sure. But the damage caused by sin is also real, and it can't be reversed. One of the vivid memories I have of being in youth group as a teenager was the night that our leader brought a paper plate and a big tube of toothpaste. And she passed around the paper plate, and she let us squeeze out the toothpaste. And we got to squeeze it from the middle of the tube, like your mom would never let you do. And it felt really good, and we passed it around, and we squeezed all that toothpaste out. And we had a huge pile on the plate, and she said, "Great, now put it back in there." The repercussions of David's sin have only just begun to take place. The child born to Bathsheba is ill, and although David prays for him and sleeps on the ground and keeps watch and begs God to let his son live, on the seventh day the baby dies. And yet, this is not the end of all hope. This is the third major tragedy for Bathsheba since David came into her life. But this time, something is different. David comforts his wife. This is the first indication of David considering her feelings or her needs. There's promise for the future. And Bathsheba's story does not end here. God has much more in store for her. Later on in 2 Samuel, we learn that she gave wise counsel to David on his deathbed. And in 1 Kings, we find out that she was a close advisor to their son Solomon during his reign as king. Solomon is the one that we recognize as the wise king. He's known for his wisdom. And some of that wisdom he directly attributes to his mother. Proverbs 31 is one example. He notes that it was learned from his mother. It includes exhortations for those who are in positions of power, especially kings. Verse 8 says, "Speak out on behalf of the voiceless and for the rights of all who are vulnerable." Do you think perhaps when she taught her son that she was speaking out of her own experience? That she was teaching him to learn from his father's mistakes? That she was setting a new vision for life as God intends? Bathsheba was a woman of great faith. She is that woman described in Proverbs 31, where it says, "Charm is deceptive and beauty fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised." Bathsheba's faithfulness and wisdom shaped not just her son, but countless generations to come. And like Ruth, Bathsheba is one of the few women named in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. So what message are we to take from this story? Is it, don't break God's law? Is it, sin has its consequences, not just for the sinner? Is it that we hurt others when we go against God's command in ways that we can't always foresee? Or are we to learn from Nathan, the truth teller? Are we to call out sin, to speak out on behalf of the voiceless and the vulnerable? Because that sounds an awful lot like what Jesus taught. Stories like this one of David and Bathsheba show us the worst of human brokenness, and yet we also get these glimpses of God's grace and love. So a few weeks ago, when we were still at the beginning of this journey, we read the story of Joseph and his 11 brothers, and we heard Joseph say that God took something that they intended for evil and used it for good. And today we can see that God did indeed work in Bathsheba's life. Nothing could take away the damage that had been done by the wrongs committed against her. Nothing could take that back. Yet we see God at work in her strength and her wisdom as she raises her son to be a wise king. And as we continue to move through the Old Testament, we have to face the truth of the human condition over and over again, that people are broken and imperfect. But as we journey through this Old Testament, we also get to see the divine possibility and the truth that people are made in God's image, and that by God's power, we can continue learning to live and love like Jesus, with perfect love and with grace. May it be so.